On December 14th, 2019, the United States Coast Guard boarded a vessel 400 miles off its last known position in the Bering Sea. The Northern Star hung in the black water, navigation lights glowing against the Arctic night, engine idling in perfect mechanical rhythm. The boarding team found the galley clean, the bunk made, every system functioning exactly as designed. What they did not find was David Kowalski. 9 months earlier, in March 2019, Kowalski had departed Dutch Harbor, Alaska, for what should have been a routine 6-week halibut season. He was a veteran fisherman with over 2 decades navigating waters that kill the unprepared. He knew the Bering Sea, he respected it, and then he vanished. When the Coast Guard finally located his vessel in December, the evidence inside told a story that made no sense. Every food item consumed, all 90 days of fuel burned. His daily logbook meticulously maintained for 178 days until September 17th, where the final entry reads, "Day 100 of 78. They said I could leave tomorrow if I..." The sentence ends. The pen trails off mid-word. Beside his bunk, investigators found 43 tally marks carved into the wood, one for each day after his food ran out. This is the story of a man who survived the impossible, documented his own slow starvation, and then disappeared the moment rescue seemed inevitable. This is the story of the Northern Star. David Kowalski understood cold water the way most people understand pavement. For 23 years, he had worked the commercial fishing grounds of the Bering Sea, operating out of Dutch Harbor on Alaska's Aleutian Chain. In a profession where experience separates survivors from statistics, Kowalski belonged to the former category. He was 49 years old in March 2019. He had outlived friends, shipmates, and younger men who thought they could match the ocean's indifference with bravado. They were wrong. Kowalski never made that mistake. In Dutch Harbor, a working port where sentiment yields to the practical realities of survival, Kowalski was known as competent. The description might sound unremarkable, but in that context, it represented the highest compliment. He ran a tight operation. He maintained his equipment. He returned when he said he would. Fellow fishermen who worked those same grounds described him as a lone wolf, a professional who preferred solitary runs over crew operations. This wasn't antisocial behavior. It was efficiency. One man meant one share, total control, and no liability for another person's mistakes. The Northern Star reflected its captain. The 38-foot commercial fishing vessel wasn't new, but Kowalski maintained it with clinical precision. The engine received scheduled maintenance. Navigation systems were current. Communication equipment, VHF radio, satellite phone, and an EP-IRB emergency beacon functioned perfectly. The boat's logs showed methodical record-keeping, fuel consumption, position reports, equipment checks documented in the same neat handwriting that would later appear in his final journal entries. Kowalski lived modestly in Dutch Harbor during the off-season. He rented a small apartment near the harbor. He didn't drink heavily. He didn't draw attention. People who knew him described a man who was private but not secretive, solitary but not unfriendly. He had family in the lower 48, a sister in Oregon, a brother in Washington, but his real relationship was with the work. The Bering Sea demanded respect, preparation, and acceptance of its absolute authority over human life. He gave it all three. In late February 2019, Kowalski began preparing for the spring halibut season. Dutch Harbor's commercial docks saw the familiar ritual: vessels being loaded, gear inspected, captains filing their intended routes with harbor authorities. The halibut season typically ran 6 weeks, sometimes stretching to 8, depending on quotas and weather. Kowalski filed a standard trip plan, 6 weeks, departing mid-March, returning late April. But the dock workers noticed something unusual. Port supply records from March 2019 show Kowalski purchased provisions for 90 days. 3 months, triple the duration of his filed plan. This wasn't a small discrepancy. It was groceries, fuel, and supplies scaled for an extended voyage. When one of the dock supervisors mentioned it, Kowalski's response was characteristically minimal. Better to have it and not need it. For a Bering Sea fisherman, the logic wasn't absurd. Weather could pin you down. Equipment could fail. Ice could close routes. Carrying extra provisions represented prudent seamanship, not paranoia. But 90 days wasn't cautious. It was deliberate. No one pressed the issue. Kowalski paid for his supplies, loaded the Northern Star with methodical efficiency, and completed his pre-departure checks. On March 12, 2019, harbor records show he topped off his fuel tanks, enough for extended operations far beyond coastal waters. His paperwork was clean. His vessel passed inspection. By every official measure, David Kowalski was prepared for a routine fishing season, except for the provisions, and except for one other detail that wouldn't emerge until much later. 3 days before departure, Kowalski updated his will. He visited a notary in Dutch Harbor, signed the documents, and filed them with his attorney in Oregon. Estate planning wasn't unusual for fishermen. The Bering Sea kills approximately 300 people per year in maritime accidents, but the timing caught his sister's attention when she learned about it months later. He hadn't mentioned it during their last phone call. He hadn't explained why, after 23 years of fishing, he suddenly felt compelled to formalize his affairs. On March 15, 2019, at 05:47 hours, the Northern Star departed Dutch Harbor. Weather conditions were cold but clear. Sea state was moderate. Kowalski's last radio contact with harbor operations was brief and professional, confirming his departure, his intended fishing grounds 200 miles northwest, and his expected return in 6 weeks. The harbor operator who logged the transmission remembered nothing unusual about the exchange. Kowalski sounded like he always did. Calm, focused, ready for work. It was the last time anyone heard his voice. The Northern Star cleared Dutch Harbor's breakwater at 0612 hours on March 15, 2019, disappearing into the gray expanse where the Bering Sea meets the North Pacific. For the first 72 hours, Kowalski's voyage proceeded exactly as filed. Automated identification system records, the maritime tracking network that monitors vessel positions, showed the Northern Star heading northwest toward the fishing grounds he declared in his trip plan. On March 18th, at 14:34 hours, Kowalski made his scheduled check-in call via satellite phone to the Dutch harbor master's office. The conversation lasted 43 seconds. He reported his position, confirmed normal operations, and stated sea conditions were favorable. His voice displayed no stress. The harbor master noted the call in the log and moved on to other business. That communication followed standard protocol. Commercial fishermen operating in remote Bering Sea waters typically check in every 72 hours, providing position updates and status reports. The system isn't mandatory for vessels under a certain tonnage, but experienced captains maintain the practice anyway. If something goes wrong, those radio calls establish the last known position, critical information for search and rescue operations. Kowalski knew this. He had made hundreds of such calls over 2 decades. His next scheduled check-in was March 21st. It never came. When a fisherman misses one check-in, it rarely triggers immediate alarm. Satellite phone systems fail. Weather interferes with signals. Captains get busy working gear and forget to call. The harbor master's office noted the missed contact but took no action. They would wait for the next scheduled window. March 24th. No contact. March 27th. No contact. By the end of March, Kowalski had missed 3 consecutive check-ins spanning 9 days. The harbor master's office attempted to raise him via VHF radio on standard maritime channels. No response. They sent messages to his satellite phone. No reply. Other fishing vessels operating in the general region were asked to keep watch for the Northern Star. No sightings. On April 2nd, 18 days after his last confirmed communication, the harbor master contacted Kowalski's listed emergency contact, his sister in Oregon. She hadn't heard from him either, but she wasn't immediately concerned. David often went weeks without calling family when he was working. The sea consumed his attention. She told the harbor master to keep trying. April 15th marked the approximate midpoint of Kowalski's planned 6-week voyage. He should have been actively fishing, his hold filling with halibut, his routine check-ins confirming steady progress. Instead, there was silence. Complete, unbroken silence. The AIS tracking data told an increasingly strange story. The automated system showed the Northern Star's last recorded position on March 19th, 1 day after Kowalski's final satellite phone call. After that point, the vessel's transponder went dark. Either it had been switched off, had malfunctioned, or the vessel had been destroyed so completely that the system lost power. But there was no distress call. The Northern Star carried an EPIRB, an emergency position indicating radio beacon designed to activate automatically if a vessel sinks or lists beyond a certain angle. The device is engineered to survive catastrophic events, broadcasting a distress signal that satellites detect instantly. Coast Guard records show no EPIRB activation from Kowalski's beacon. If the Northern Star had gone down in a storm, capsized in heavy seas, or suffered a hull breach, the EPIRB should have triggered. It didn't. By late April, when Kowalski's planned return date came and passed, his sister filed an official missing person report. The United States Coast Guard opened a case file and began preliminary inquiries. They reviewed his trip plan, contacted Dutch harbor operations, and pulled his communication records. Everything pointed to a vessel and captain that had simply stopped existing on March 19th. On May 8th, 2019, the Coast Guard launched an active search operation. District 17, responsible for Alaska's coastal waters, deployed HC-13, a Hercules aircraft equipped with advanced search radar. They covered a grid pattern spanning the Northern Star's intended fishing grounds, extending the search radius to account for drift, mechanical failure, or course deviation. The aircraft flew low-altitude patterns in clear weather, scanning thousands of square miles of open ocean. They found nothing. No debris field, no oil slick, no life raft, no visual or radar contact with a 38-foot fishing vessel that should have been highly visible against empty sea. The Bering Sea is vast, but it's not infinite. A vessel that size, even adrift and powerless, creates a radar signature. Search protocols account for current, wind, and the statistical probability of drift patterns. The Coast Guard knows how to find missing boats, but the Northern Star had vanished as thoroughly as if it had never existed. The search operation continued for 11 days, expanding to cover over 15,000 square miles. Additional vessels joined the effort. Commercial fishermen operating in the region kept watch. Weather reconnaissance flights documented sea conditions. Every reasonable scenario was considered. Mechanical failure leading to foundering, collision with ice or debris, rogue wave capsizing, medical emergency incapacitating the captain. None of the scenarios explained the complete absence of evidence. On May 19th, after consulting weather data, drift models, and probability assessments, the Coast Guard suspended active search operations. The official determination, David Kowalski and the Northern Star were lost at sea, presumed sunk in an undetermined incident occurring sometime after March 19th. The case remained open, but without new information, there was nothing more to search for. Kowalski's family received the notification. His sister began the process of settling his estate. The fishing community in Dutch Harbor added another name to the informal roll of those claimed by the Bering Sea. By June 2019, most people who had known David Kowalski accepted that he was gone. The ocean had kept him. But the 90 days of provisions remained unexplained. In all the official reports, incident analyses, and Coast Guard documentation, no one could offer a satisfactory reason why an experienced fisherman planning a 6-week voyage would load supplies for 3 months. Some speculated he intended to extend his trip if fishing was good. Others suggested he was simply overcautious after years of near misses and bad weather. His sister offered a different possibility. In a statement to investigators, she mentioned that during their last conversation in February, David had seemed distracted, not upset, not afraid, just somewhere else mentally, as if working through a problem he wouldn't discuss. When she asked if everything was okay, he'd said yes. But she didn't believe him. The updated will, the triple provisions, the distracted final conversation, none of it proved anything. But together, the details suggested a man who was preparing for something more than a standard fishing season. Whether that preparation was precaution or plan, no one could say. And then, for 9 months, there was nothing but silence and the slow acceptance of loss. Until December 14th, 2019, when a cargo ship spotted something impossible in the empty dark of the Bering Sea. Late April passed, then early May. At first, the silence wasn't unusual. David Kowalski had spent 2 decades working the Bering Sea, and those who knew him understood his rhythm. Radio contact could be sporadic when a man was focused on his catch, working 18-hour days, hauling halibut from depths that would crush an unprepared vessel. His family had learned not to expect daily check-ins. The sea demanded total attention, and David gave it. But by mid-May, the silence had weight. His daughter made the first call to the harbor master at Dutch Harbor on May 14th. The Northern Star should have returned 2 weeks earlier. David's satellite phone rang through to voicemail. His emergency radio frequencies remained dead. The harbor master checked the logs. No communication since early April. Nothing unusual in those final transmissions. Weather reports, position updates, the routine exchanges of a working fisherman, then nothing. May 16th, the family filed an official missing person report with the Coast Guard. What followed was a mobilization on a scale that revealed both the severity of the situation and the brutal mathematics of searching the Bering Sea. The United States Coast Guard launched a full search and rescue operation, designating David Kowalski as a missing mariner in one of the most dangerous marine environments on Earth. They deployed C-13O Hercules aircraft from Air Station Kodiak. These 4-engine turboprops, designed specifically for maritime patrol, began flying grid patterns over thousands of square miles of open ocean. Each flight covered enormous distances, trained observers scanning the water below for any sign of a 38-foot fishing vessel or its debris field. The search altitude allowed them to see roughly 20 miles in any direction under good conditions. Conditions in the Bering Sea are rarely good. Coast Guard cutters joined the aerial search, their crews understanding exactly what they were looking for and what it likely meant if they found it. In these waters, survival time for man in the water measured in minutes, not hours. If the Northern Star had gone down catastrophically, a hull breach, a rogue wave, an engine fire, David Kowalski would have had precious little time to activate his emergency position. indicating radio beacon, deploy his life raft, and don his survival suit. The EPIRB was the critical factor. Every commercial fishing vessel operating in Alaskan waters was required to carry one. When activated, either manually or automatically upon immersion, it transmitted a distress signal via satellite, providing GPS coordinates accurate to within 100 meters. It was designed to save lives in exactly this scenario: a vessel in distress, a fisherman who couldn't make radio contact. David Kowalski's EPIRB never transmitted. The search grid expanded. Coordinators factored in currents, drift patterns, weather systems that had moved through the area since his last confirmed position in early April. They calculated probable trajectories for a disabled vessel, for debris, for a life raft carried by prevailing winds. The Bering Sea is not the open Pacific. It's a defined basin, bounded by Alaska to the east, Russia to the west, and the Aleutian Islands to the south. But defined is relative when the search area encompasses over 2 million square kilometers of water. Week 1 yielded nothing. No debris field, no oil slick, no life raft drifting with its distress beacon flashing, no wreckage washed up on remote coastlines. Week 2 produced the same result. The aircraft logged hundreds of flight hours. The cutters burned thousands of gallons of fuel steaming through search sectors. Trained eyes strained at monitors and scanned horizons. The coordination was flawless, the effort exhaustive, and the ocean gave them absolutely nothing. By early June, the active search and rescue operation faced the grim calculus that governed all such operations. Resources were finite. Other emergencies demanded response. Survival time had long since expired. The probability of finding David Kowalski alive had dropped to statistical zero. The probability of finding him at all, even his remains, even his vessel, diminished. With each passing day, as currents dispersed whatever evidence might exist across an area larger than some nations. June 8th, the Coast Guard suspended active search operations. The terminology was precise. Not ended, but suspended. Not deceased, but lost at sea. The distinction carried legal and administrative weight. But for David Kowalski's family, the practical meaning was clear. No one was looking anymore. His name was added to the long list of commercial fishermen claimed by the Bering Sea, part of the grim statistics that made this profession one of the deadliest in the world. Fishing in these waters killed men at a rate 23 times higher than the national average for all occupations. David knew those numbers. Every fisherman who worked the Bering understood the risks. Understanding risks and accepting them were different things. His family struggled with both. The mystery settled into a terrible waiting pattern. Missing, not confirmed dead. Lost at sea, but without the closure of recovered remains or wreckage. The Northern Star had simply ceased to exist somewhere between Dutch Harbor and the fishing grounds, taking its captain with it into the vast indifference of the ocean. For 9 months, that's where the story seemed to end. No new information emerged. No debris washed ashore. No distress signals arrived years late through some technical malfunction. The case went cold in the way that maritime disappearances often do. Not with answers, but with silence that gradually calcified into presumed death. His family began the slow, painful process of mourning without a body, without a grave, without the definitive end that death certificates and funerals provide. They held a memorial service in July. They began sorting through his belongings, the administrative dissolution of a life lived mostly on the water. The ocean had swallowed him whole, as it had swallowed so many before him. That conclusion would have been tragic but comprehensible. Dangerous profession, treacherous waters, experienced man undone by the random violence of the sea. It happened. It would happen again. But that conclusion was wrong. The summer of 2019 passed, then autumn. For David Kowalski's family, those months compressed into a single sustained ache. The hope that sustained them through May and June, the irrational belief that somehow, despite all evidence, he might still be found, gradually gave way to something harder and more permanent. Acceptance without closure, loss without finality. His daughter packed up his apartment in Homer. 20 years of a fisherman's accumulated life fit into surprisingly few boxes. Foul weather gear that still smelled of salt and diesel. Logbooks from previous seasons, filled with his precise handwriting, documenting catches and coordinates and weather patterns. Photographs of him aboard various vessels over the decades, his face aging but his posture always the same, competent, self-contained, at home on the water. The Northern Star appeared in many of those photographs. He'd bought her in 2011, a significant investment for a solo operator. 38 feet of fiberglass and diesel engine, outfitted with professional-grade electronics and safety equipment. She wasn't beautiful, but she was capable. David maintained her with the same meticulous attention he applied to everything connected to his work. Now both man and vessel were gone. The financial unraveling began. His boat insurance policy had specific terms regarding vessels lost at sea. Without wreckage recovery or confirmed casualty, the claim entered a waiting period. His daughter discovered that lost at sea existed in a bureaucratic limbo, not definitively dead, not provably destroyed, just absent. Banks, insurance companies, and government agencies each had different thresholds for declaring someone deceased without a body. 7 years was the standard waiting period in Alaska for a missing person to be declared legally dead. 7 years before his estate could be settled, his debts resolved, his existence officially concluded. His family couldn't wait 7 years. They petitioned for an earlier declaration of death, submitting the Coast Guard search reports, the expert testimony about survival times in Bering Sea waters, the complete absence of any contact or evidence since April. The legal process ground forward with bureaucratic slowness, processing grief into paperwork. In October, 6 months after David's disappearance, a judge granted the petition. David Kowalski was legally declared deceased, lost at sea in the course of his profession. His death certificate listed the date as May 1st, 2019. An administrative estimation. A date chosen because it fell within the window when he should have returned to port but didn't. The actual date he died remained unknown. His memorial service, held back in July, had drawn dozens of people, other fishermen, harbor master staff, former crewmates from years past. They told stories of David's competence, his dry humor, his reputation as someone who could read weather and water better than most men read books. They described him as solitary but not unfriendly, professional to his core, the kind of fisherman who made it look easier than it was. They spoke about him in past tense, even then knowing that the ocean rarely returned what it took. The months after the memorial were quieter. His daughter returned to her life in Seattle. His sister dealt with the remaining administrative tasks. Friends checked in less frequently as the immediate crisis faded into settled loss. The Bering Sea fishing community moved on because it had to. The next season was coming. Boats needed preparation. The work continued regardless of who it had claimed. By December, 9 months after David Kowalski vanished, his story had completed its expected arc. Missing, searched for, not found, declared dead, mourned, remembered. The mystery wasn't satisfying, but it was comprehensible. The Bering Sea killed men. That was simply fact. Sometimes it returned bodies or wreckage, providing the hard evidence that allowed families to understand exactly what had happened. Often it didn't, leaving only absence and extrapolation. David's case seemed to be the latter. Somewhere out there, in waters that reached depths of over 15,000 feet, the Northern Star rested on the bottom, with her captain sealed inside or floating in the currents. Or perhaps she'd broken apart in a storm, scattering debris across hundreds of miles. Or maybe a catastrophic hull failure had sent her down too fast for David to react, the ocean rushing in before he could even reach for his survival suit. The scenarios were endless, and none of them mattered. The result was identical. He was gone. His family tried to find peace in that. The ocean had taken him, as it had taken so many others. He died doing what he knew, in the environment he'd chosen to work despite its dangers. There was a kind of completeness to that, even if it lacked the closure that comes with recovered remains. December brought the 9-month mark. Winter settled over the Bering Sea, bringing worse weather and shorter days. The fishing fleet that worked these waters reduced operations during the darkest months. Ice formed in the northern reaches. The water temperature dropped to lethal levels where survival time for an immersed human measured in single-digit minutes. The Northern Star had been missing for 274 days. The investigation file remained technically open. Missing person cases never officially close, but no active work continued. There was nothing to investigate. The Coast Guard had searched. They'd found nothing. The man was declared legally dead. The case was, for all practical purposes, resolved. That resolution lasted until December 19th, when a cargo ship's routine navigation watch spotted something impossible in the winter darkness of the Bering Sea. A small fishing vessel, running lights on, drifting 400 miles off course. The crew of the EM-V, Orion Bell, had been at sea for 11 days when they spotted it. December 14th, 2019, 2:17 p.m. Approximately 400 miles northwest of Unalaska Island, in a stretch of the Bering Sea where commercial fishing vessels had no reason to be. The Orion Bell, a 900-foot container ship running the Trans-Pacific route from Seattle to Yokohama, was maintaining its course through moderate swells when the second mate noticed something on the radar that didn't match any charted traffic. A small vessel, stationary, alone. At first, Captain Raymond Chen assumed it was a data error. Fishing boats didn't drift this far from established grounds. The halibut season was long over. Winter storms made these waters hostile to anything smaller than a cargo ship. But the radar signature persisted, and when Chen trained binoculars on the coordinates, he saw it. A dark hull rising and falling with the swells, navigation lights glowing faintly in the gray afternoon. The Orion Bell altered course. As they closed to within 500 yards, Chen attempted radio contact on Channel 16, the international hailing frequency. No response. He tried again. Silence. The VHF calls went unanswered, but the vessel's running lights remained on. And through the binoculars, Chen could see something that made him reach for the satellite phone to contact the Coast Guard. The boat's engine was running. He could see the faint shimmer of exhaust from the stack. The vessel was powered, lit, and apparently abandoned. Coast Guard Station Kodiak received the call at 3:41 p.m. The coordinates placed the vessel outside normal search grids, in deep water far from shipping lanes. The Orion Bell reported no visible crew, no response to hails, and no signs of distress beyond the vessel's inexplicable location. A Marine Board operator ran the boat's registration through the database using the hull numbers Chen relayed. The Northern Star, registered owner, David Kowalski, reported missing since May 2019. The cutter USCGC Douglas Munro was diverted from patrol and reached the coordinates at 9:23 p.m. under full darkness. Floodlights illuminated the Northern Star as the Coast Guard boarding team prepared to transfer. What they saw in that harsh white light was a vessel that appeared in every technical sense, operational. Navigation lights functioning. Deck clear of debris. No visible hull damage. The engine's low rumble audible even over the wind. 4 Coast Guard personnel boarded at 9:47 p.m. Petty Officer First Class Marcus Delgado led the team. His report, filed 3 hours later, describes a scene that violated every expectation of what a 9-month derelict vessel should look like. The deck was not chaos. Fishing gear was stowed properly. Lines were coiled. The wheelhouse door was closed but not locked. When Delgado pushed it open, the interior lights were on. The cabin was warm. The engine had been heating the small space for months, burning through fuel in an empty room. The control panel showed the autopilot disengaged, the throttle set to low idle. The GPS unit was still powered, its screen displaying a position log that ended on September 17th at 3:47 a.m., the last time anyone had interacted with the navigation system. The Northern Star had been drifting for nearly 3 months since that moment. Engine running the entire time, burning fuel in a slow mechanical vigil over an absent crew. Delgado called out. No response. The team swept the vessel room by room. The small galley, the head, the cramped sleeping compartment. Every space empty. No David Kowalski. No sign of anyone. But there were signs of habitation. Recent habitation. The bunk was made, blanket pulled tight in the military-style corners that suggested either fastidious discipline or a man trying to maintain structure in an unraveling situation. Kowalski's foul-weather gear hung on its hook beside the door, still damp with salt spray that hadn't had time to fully dry. A coffee mug sat in the galley sink, rinsed but not washed. Small details that suggested a person who had stepped away moments ago, not months. The life raft was still in its mounted bracket on the aft deck, fully secured, never deployed. Delgado's team checked the emergency locator beacon. It had not been activated. The EPIRB, designed to automatically trigger if submerged, showed no record of water contact. If Kowalski had gone overboard, he had done so without triggering any of the safety systems designed to save him. The radio was functional. The satellite phone was charged and operational, though its last outgoing call was logged in March. The vessel had the means to communicate. It simply hadn't. At 10:15 p.m., Delgado radioed the Douglas Munro with preliminary findings. Vessel secure, no personnel aboard, no signs of distress or emergency, engine operational, all safety equipment present and accounted for. The Northern Star wasn't a wreck. It was a ghost ship in the most literal sense, a vessel that continued to function long after its crew had disappeared. The Douglas Munro took the Northern Star under tow at first light. By December 16th, the vessel was secured in Dutch Harbor, the same port Kowalski had departed from 9 months earlier. What had begun as a rescue operation was now something else entirely, a forensic investigation into a boat that had survived its captain. The investigators who processed the Northern Star over the following days would find no answers to the central question, where David Kowalski had gone. But they would find evidence of something that seemed, in its own way, impossible. They would find proof that he had survived far longer than anyone thought possible, and that he had done so alone. The forensic examination of the Northern Star began on December 17th, 2019, in a secured section of Dutch Harbor's commercial dock. Coast Guard investigators, joined by marine surveyors and forensic specialists from the Alaska Bureau of Investigation, processed the vessel as both a potential crime scene and a source of answers about David Kowalski's final months. What they documented was a timeline written in empty containers and burned fuel. The galley was the first space cataloged. Every storage compartment was opened and inventoried. The results were absolute. 0 food remained aboard. Not a single can in the lockers. No dried goods in the overhead bins. No emergency rations in the survival kit. The investigators found 127 empty food cans, beans, stew, soup, vegetables, stacked in a plastic bin beneath the sink. Cardboard boxes that had held crackers, rice, and pasta were broken down and stored in the recycling bag Kowalski had apparently maintained, even in extremity. The freezer, which ran off the boat's electrical system, had been empty for months. Its interior showed no frost, suggesting it had been turned off to conserve power once its contents were consumed. The refrigerator held only empty plastic containers with residue that field tests identified as cooking oil and butter. Investigators cross-referenced the provisions list Kowalski had filed with the harbor master in March. He had loaded supplies for 90 days, 180 pounds of canned goods, 40 pounds of rice, 30 pounds of pasta, 20 pounds of dried beans, flour, sugar, cooking oil, coffee, salt, and a variety of freeze-dried camping meals. Enough to sustain one man for 3 months with careful rationing. The empty cans and packaging confirmed he had consumed it all, every single item. The fuel situation told the same story. The Northern Star had departed with 320 gallons of diesel in its main tank, enough for approximately 90 days of operation if the engine ran continuously at low throttle, which is exactly what Kowalski had done. When the vessel was recovered, 14 gallons remained. The engine had been running on idle for 9 months, burning fuel at the minimum rate necessary to keep systems powered and the cabin heated. Investigators calculated the math. If Kowalski had burned through 306 gallons over 275 days, from March 19th to December 14th, he had kept the engine running the entire time, rationing fuel with the same discipline he had applied to food. He had stretched 90 days of supplies across more than 9 months of survival. But the fuel burn rate revealed something else. For the first 178 days, the engine had run at slightly higher throttle, likely to maintain maneuverability and power the navigation systems Kowalski was still using. After September 17th, the date of his final log entry, the throttle had been set to minimum idle, just enough to keep the engine from stalling. The shift suggested a change in circumstance, a moment when active survival became passive endurance. The logbook provided the human narrative behind the numbers. It was found in the wheelhouse, placed neatly on the navigation desk beside the GPS unit. A standard ship's log, the kind every commercial vessel is required to maintain. David Kowalski had kept his with meticulous care. The entries began March 19th, 2019, at 600 hours, and continued daily for 178 days. Each entry recorded position, weather, sea state, engine status, and fuel levels. The handwriting in the early weeks was steady and precise. Kowalski noted fishing activity, equipment checks, and minor repairs. On March 24th, he recorded his first halibut catch. On April 2nd, he noted a hydraulic issue with the winch and described the fix. The entries read like any professional mariner's log, technical, factual, unremarkable. But as weeks became months, the entries changed. By late May, when he should have returned to port, the tone shifted. May 28th, radio malfunction, unable to transmit, working on repair. June 3rd, still no comms, engine running rough, conserving fuel. June 10th, position holding, weather clear, rations at 60%. The log confirmed what investigators suspected. Kowalski had experienced some kind of communications failure early in his trip that left him unable to call for help, and he had made the decision to stay with the vessel and ration supplies rather than abandon ship. It was the choice of a man who trusted his skills and his boat, who believed he could outlast the problem. As summer progressed, the entries became shorter. July 15th, day 118, fuel 40%, food 35%, sea calm. August 1st, day 100 to 35, rationing hard now, engine idle only. The handwriting grew less steady, the letters slightly larger, as if written with more effort. By late August, Kowalski's log entries consisted of only a few words. August 29th, day 163, still here. September 5th, day 170, waiting. September 12th, day 175, cold. The final entry was dated September the 17th, 2019, day 178. They said I could leave tomorrow if I... The sentence ended there. The pen had trailed off the page in a slight downward curve, as if his hand had simply stopped moving mid-word. There was no signature, no closing note, just the incomplete thought and the silence that followed. Investigators examined the page under magnification. There were no signs of struggle, no smudging or tearing that would suggest the pen had been knocked from his hand. The trailing ink line was smooth and continuous, fading gradually as the pen lost contact with the paper. It was the mark of someone who had stopped writing, not someone who had been interrupted. But the word "they" anchored every subsequent theory about what had happened. Kowalski had been alone. Every piece of evidence confirmed he was the only person aboard the Northern Star for the entire 9 months. So who was "they"? The psychological assessment commissioned by the Coast Guard noted that extreme isolation and malnutrition can cause auditory and visual hallucinations. After 178 days alone at sea, with diminishing food and the cognitive effects of starvation setting in, Kowalski may have been experiencing breaks from reality. They could have been voices he heard, figures he saw, rescue ships that existed only in his deteriorating mind. But the phrasing suggested something more structured than random hallucination. They said I could leave tomorrow if I had the cadence of negotiation, of conditions being set. It implied communication, interaction, a conversation Kowalski believed he was having with someone. The investigators found no evidence of anyone else aboard. No extra clothing, no additional personal effects, no second bunk disturbed. The food consumption matched one person eating carefully rationed meals. The fuel burn matched one engine running continuously with no variation that would suggest multiple operators. David Kowalski had survived 178 days alone. The logbook, the empty food stores, and the fuel records proved it. He had done what few could do, stretched 90 days of supplies across half a year through discipline and skill. And then, on day 178, he wrote about "they." The investigators found them beside his bunk. 43 marks carved into the wooden wall of the Northern Star's cabin, each one a single vertical line scratched deep into the grain. Not pen marks, not chalk. Carved with something metal, likely the fishing knife found on his navigation table, its blade showing wood residue when examined in the Coast Guard forensics lab. The marks were organized in traditional 5-bar gates, 8 complete sets of 5, then 3 additional lines, someone keeping precise count. Lead investigator Marcus Chen photographed each mark individually under raking light. The depth varied. The first few cuts were shallow, controlled. By the third set, they gouged deeper. The final 3 were carved so hard they splintered the wood. The Coast Guard mapped these marks against the logbook timeline and the food inventory. The mathematics were brutal. Kowalski departed Dutch Harbor on March 12th with 90 days of provisions. His final logbook entry was dated September 17th, day 178 of his voyage. 90 days of food stretched across 178 days meant he'd consumed his last meal sometime around June 10th. The 43 tally marks documented what came after. June 11th through July 23rd, 43 days with nothing. Forensic pathologist Dr. Sarah Vance reviewed the evidence for the official Coast Guard report. Her assessment was clinical. A healthy adult male can survive approximately 30 to 40 days without food, depending on initial body mass, water availability, and environmental conditions. Kowalski had water. The ship's desalination system was operational when recovered. Temperature inside the cabin ranged between 45 and 52 degrees Fahrenheit based on seasonal Bering Sea averages, cold but not immediately fatal. 43 days exceeded the typical survival window. Not by much, but enough to classify Kowalski's endurance as statistically exceptional. What the marks represented wasn't just survival. They represented consciousness, awareness. The deliberate choice each morning to carve another line into the wall, to acknowledge another 24 hours completed, to maintain, count even as his body consumed itself. Starvation follows a documented progression. The body burns through glycogen reserves in the first 72 hours, then transitions to fat metabolism. When fat stores deplete, it begins catabolizing muscle tissue, including cardiac muscle. Cognitive function deteriorates. Fine motor control fails. The simple act of gripping a knife and carving a straight line becomes difficult after week 3. Yet Kowalski carved 43 marks. Chen's team found additional evidence of his physical decline throughout the cabin. Loose clothing hung in the small closet, a coat, spare coveralls, all showing signs they'd become too large for the man who wore them. A belt on the floor had been tightened to a new hole punched crudely through the leather, beyond the manufactured notches. The makeshift hole was positioned 4 inches past the original. His medical records listed his departure weight at 192 pounds. The Coast Guard consulted with survival physiologists who estimated he would have lost approximately 40% of his body mass during 43 days of complete starvation. Roughly 75 to 80 pounds. The man who carved the final tally mark weighed perhaps 110 pounds. But he carved it. Got out of his bunk, picked up the knife, added the 43rd line to his count. Then something changed. The logbook entries continued past the point when the food ran out. Day 91 through day 178 were documented, though the handwriting showed progressive deterioration. The entries grew shorter, less detailed. Day 134, position holding, no contact. Day 156, water system functional. Day 167, still here. Then September the 17th, day 178, the entry that ended mid-sentence. The timing didn't align. If the tally marks documented days without food, the 43rd mark corresponded to July 23rd. His final log entry was dated September the 17th, 56 days later. Either he stopped making tally marks on day 43, or the marks documented something else entirely. Chen returned to the cabin wall photographs. He examined the area around the marks under magnification. Just below the 43rd line, he found something the initial survey had missed. A single word carved into the wood in letters half the size of the tally marks. Enough. The word was carved with the same knife, but the depth and pressure were different. Lighter, more controlled, not scratched in desperation, but inscribed with deliberate care. Enough food gone, enough days counted, enough endurance proved, enough waiting. The word offered no clarity, only confirmation that on day 43 of his starvation, David Kowalski made a conscious decision to stop counting. The logbook was a standard commercial fishing record, wire-bound with water-resistant pages. David Kowalski had maintained it since the Northern Star's departure, 1 entry per day, usually written in the evening. The handwriting was consistent for the first 90 days. Neat block letters, professional abbreviations for weather conditions and coordinates, fish counts recorded with precision. March 12th through June 9th, documented a competent fisherman executing a routine halibut season. Position reports, engine maintenance notes, weather patterns, nothing irregular. Then the entries changed. June 10th, day 91. Last meal, 0600 hours. Inventoried remaining supplies. Rationing no longer viable. Position 56.4 degrees north, 172.1 degrees west. Radio still dead. Engine functional, but holding position to conserve fuel. The handwriting was the same but compressed, as if he was forcing himself to maintain standards while conserving energy for the physical act of writing. June 18th, day 99. 1 week no food. Weakness significant. Reduced all non-essential activity. Water system operational. Weather holding. June 30th, day 111. Dizzy when standing. Staying in bunk most of the day. Still tracking position. July 15th, day 126. Hard to write. Hands shake. Saw ship on horizon yesterday or maybe not. The entries after mid-July became sporadic. Day 134. Day 142. Day 156. Single sentences. Fragments. But the documentation continued. August 29th, day 171. Something wrong with time. September 8th, day 179. They came today. The next entry was dated September 17th, 9 days later. Day 178, a date that didn't follow the previous entry's timeline. Either Kowalski had miscounted, or he'd stopped perceiving time linearly. The final entry filled half a page in handwriting that was barely legible, the letters wandering across the lines. Day 178. They said I could leave tomorrow if I... The sentence ended there. The pen had dragged down the page in a diagonal line, then stopped. Coast Guard linguists and forensic document examiners spent 47 hours analyzing those 14 words. They was the only plural pronoun in the entire logbook after June 10th. For months, Kowalski had written exclusively in first person. I saw, I checked, I need. The sudden appearance of other people in his narrative was jarring. 3 primary interpretations emerged. First, hallucinations. Starvation-induced psychosis manifesting as external voices or presences. The research was substantial. Extreme caloric deprivation causes documented psychiatric symptoms after approximately 30 days. Auditory hallucinations, visual distortions, paranoia, dissociative episodes. Kowalski had been without food for 99 days at the time of his final entry. Hallucinated figures telling him rescue was imminent would be consistent with his psychological state. Second, actual contact. Someone came to the Northern Star on September 8th, interacted with Kowalski over the following 9 days, and set conditions for his departure. This theory required accepting that another vessel approached, made contact, but did not rescue him immediately. It required accepting that he was given an ultimatum, meet some condition, and he could leave tomorrow. Third, coded language. They referred not to people but to something else, his own failing body systems, the ship's equipment, environmental conditions. A man at the edge of cognitive collapse using pronouns loosely, personifying the forces that controlled whether he lived or died. The document examiners focused on the physical evidence. The pen stroke that ended the sentence showed no sign of sudden force or struggle. It wasn't a violent interruption. The pressure decreased gradually, as if his hand simply stopped gripping the pen and it fell from his fingers, dragging down the page under gravity alone. Medical examiner Dr. Vance proposed a fourth interpretation. The sentence ended because Kowalski lost consciousness while writing. Cardiac failure, seizure, catastrophic electrolyte imbalance. Any of these could cause sudden collapse after months of starvation. The trailing pen mark was gravity, nothing more. But this explanation failed to account for what happened next. The stopped clock read 3:47 a.m. The logbook entry wasn't time-stamped, but Kowalski's pattern throughout the journal showed he wrote in the evenings, typically between 1900 and 2100 hours. If he'd collapsed while writing at night, his body would have been found in the cabin. Instead, investigators found the bunk neatly made. His foul weather gear hung on its designated hook. The logbook was closed and placed on the navigation table, the pen clipped to the wire binding. Someone had tidied up after the incomplete entry was written. Lead investigator Chen assembled the evidence timeline. The final log entry, September 17th, evening. The stopped clock, 3:47 a.m., presumably September 18th. The abandoned vessel discovered, December 14th, 3 months later. Between the trailing pen mark and the stopped clock lay approximately 6 to 8 hours. Between the stopped clock and the discovery lay 90 days. What happened at 3:47 a.m. on September 18th remained the central question. Chen's team found no signs of forced entry, no damage to the hull, no evidence of another vessel coming alongside. The life raft was still in its deck housing, unused. The emergency beacon had never been activated. Kowalski's survival suit hung in the cabin closet. If he'd left the Northern Star voluntarily at 3:47 a.m. on a mid-September night in the Bering Sea without survival gear, he would have died from hypothermia within 20 minutes. Water temperature in September averaged 42 degrees Fahrenheit. If he'd been taken from the vessel by force, whoever removed him had done so without leaving a single trace. If he'd never left at all, if his body had gone overboard through accident or intention, the orderly cabin made no sense. The 14 words contained one final detail that every investigator noted but none could explain. They said I could leave tomorrow if I... Tomorrow. Not today. Not eventually. Tomorrow. David Kowalski wrote those words believing he had one more day to wait. One more condition to meet. One more night to survive. The stopped clock suggested he didn't make it to morning. 3 primary theories emerged from the investigation, each attempting to explain the evidence aboard the Northern Star. None fit perfectly. The captivity scenario gained traction among some investigators. This theory posits that Kowalski encountered an illegal operation, poaching vessels working protected waters, smugglers running contraband through shipping lanes, or foreign intelligence craft operating where they shouldn't be. He witnessed something he wasn't supposed to see. They boarded his vessel, took him prisoner, and used the Northern Star as a temporary base while keeping him alive for reasons unclear. They, in his final entry, referred to his captors. The promise that he could leave tomorrow was either genuine, a plan to transfer him elsewhere, or a lie to keep him compliant. When the vessel drifted too close to commercial shipping routes in December, they removed him and abandoned the boat. The theory accounts for the they. It explains the prolonged drift and why someone maintained the engine. The tidy cabin could have been straightened by captors before departure. His disappearance becomes not mysterious vanishing, but calculated removal. But the scenario carries substantial problems. Why keep a captive fisherman alive for 6 months while burning through his provisions? He possessed no ransom value, no intelligence worth extracting. Why leave the Northern Star intact and running, a floating crime scene that would inevitably be discovered? If eliminating a witness was the goal, why not scuttle the vessel entirely? And the 43 tally marks carved into the wall suggest desperation, not captivity under guard. The psychological breakdown theory presents a different explanation. Extreme isolation, combined with progressive malnutrition, creates predictable cognitive deterioration. Kowalski's lucid log entries, spanning 177 days, suggest remarkable mental fortitude, but human psychology has limits. The final entry, investigators noted, could mark the moment those limits were reached. They existed only in his mind, hallucinations born from starvation and solitude. The promised departure was a delusion. He believed rescue had arrived, or that voices were instructing him toward safety. In this fractured mental state, he calmly prepared his bunk, hung his gear, and stepped off the Northern Star into the December sea, convinced he was going somewhere. The theory aligns with documented cases of psychosis and isolation. It explains the orderly cabin, the actions of someone who believed he was simply leaving, not dying. The abrupt shift from meticulous log-keeping to incomplete sentence suggests sudden cognitive collapse rather than gradual decline. Yet Kowalski maintained detailed, rational entries for nearly 6 months under conditions that would break most people within weeks. His log showed no earlier signs of deterioration, no confused passages or irrational observations. The shift from complete lucidity to psychotic break appears too sharp, too sudden, and the tally marks demonstrate awareness. He was counting, tracking, maintaining enough grip on reality to mark each day of starvation. A third theory, considered unlikely by most investigators but impossible to fully dismiss, suggests intentional disappearance. The 90-day provision load for a 42-day trip, the solo voyage, the complete vanishing. Perhaps Kowalski planned to disappear. They were contacts he arranged to meet. The months at sea were waiting period for rendezvous. The final entry referenced his extraction. The theory collapses under the weight of the tally marks. No one endures 43 days of documented starvation as part of a plan. The consumed supplies, the burned fuel, the evidence of genuine survival desperation, all contradict voluntary disappearance. This was a man fighting to live, not staging an exit. The Coast Guard officially classified the case as a maritime disappearance with undetermined circumstances. The Northern Star was towed to port, processed for evidence, and eventually released to Kowalski's family. The logbook became part of the permanent case file. No further leads emerged. What remains is evidence without conclusion. A vessel found running after 9 months. Provisions consumed to the last can. A logbook ending mid-sentence. 43 marks carved into a wall. And David Kowalski, gone. David Kowalski departed Dutch Harbor in March 2019 for a 6-week halibut season. He survived alone on the Bering Sea for 178 days. 43 of those days came after his food ran out. His logbook, maintained with meticulous detail through nearly 6 months of isolation, ended with an incomplete thought on September the 17th. The pen trailed off mid-word. Whatever he intended to write next remains unknown. The Northern Star was recovered, but it provided no final answers. Only questions in the form of empty cans, tally marks, and that last, unfinished sentence. The investigation closed without determining what happened to him or who they were. The Bering Sea, which Kowalski knew better than most, kept its secrets. His story stands as testament to human endurance pushed past imaginable limits, and a reminder that some disappearances resist explanation. Somewhere in those vast, cold waters lies the answer to what happened in the hours after September 17th, 3:47 a.m. But the ocean offers no logbook, keeps no record, provides no closure. David Kowalski is remembered not just as a mystery, but as a man who survived the unsurvivable until he couldn't anymore. His final entry will remain forever incomplete. His story suspended mid-sentence, like his life, stopped at a moment we can see but never understand, because someone, somewhere, is still waiting for answers that may never surface.